Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Perlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the ecological impacts of war and restoration ecology, especially for marsh wetland systems, with my guest, Wayne R. Ferren, Jr. He is a botanist, a project ecologist with Arcadis Design and Consultancy, and he worked for over 26 years at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he served as the founding executive director of the Museum of Systematics and Ecology and director of the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve. He also served as the assistant director of the University of California, Santa Barbara's Natural Reserve System. He is a member of the board of directors of the Channel Islands Restoration and a Flora of New Jersey project, a member of numerous organizations, including the California Botanical Society, and he has authored over 100 scientific articles, is the recipient of many environmental awards and acknowledgments, and is the author of his most recent book, Conscientious Objector, A Journey of Peace, Justice, Culture, and Environment. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Nancy. It's an honor to be here.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading about your involvement in anti-war, pro-ecology, and how you incorporated your concerns and desire for a peaceful, equitable, and harmonious world into your life's work. Your book is so well documented, but it's a human story as well. Could you explain why you object to war and were a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War?
Yes, thank you for asking. It's part of a life journey, raised as a Christian child and then experiencing scientific education and being interested in Buddhism and transcendentalism. It's an evolution of thinking and realizing that I was against capital punishment, against killing, interested in life and the preservation of the quality of the earth. All of these things are the antithesis of destruction of human beings and ecosystems through the acts of war. War is never the answer. It leads to other wars, other conflicts. It's something that I was totally against. Now, acting on that isn't always possible for folks because they may not be thrust into the situation. But with the military draft enacted and having a low lottery number like I did, that forces one into a situation where one has to decide how to act on one's conscience.
In the book, you describe the ecosystems of Vietnam and the resources that are there. I recall the period where we were talking about needing to stop communism, but you pointed out a longer history of colonialization to utilize some of those raw resources. And you describe some of the unique flora and fauna that is found in that area. What is so special there?
Well, it is one of the biodiversity hotspots, they call it, for the planet Earth. It is very rich. It's a combination of geologic past, diversity of climate and habitats that has resulted in a great wealth of plants and animals and cultures. There are many indigenous cultures that occur there, either Aboriginal or more recently immigrated. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to point out that Vietnam is more than a war. It's in fact a wonderfully rich region, all of Southeast Asia, and it has a long cultural history. I mean, the oldest human remains maybe 30,000 years. But more importantly, when it comes to the war, our Vietnam War, we really perpetuated the colonialism of the French. And the French go back to the Catholic Church's interest in converting the locals to Catholicism back in the 19th century. That impact and the interest in the resources resulted in exploitation, human almost enslavement of cultures, and the use of those cultures to import our goods. And so our war was really an economic war. It's an economic war to protect our interests in the resources and in cheap labor and in cheap markets, rather than an anti-communist war, which is what the French wanted us to fight.
But 50 years later, the impacts of the war is horrendous, even on current generations that weren't alive then.
Yes.
You talk about the physical impacts on the land, the bomb craters all over, the removal of the wetlands and the forests. You talk about the chemical impacts and how people are still suffering from the spraying of Agents Orange, Purple, White, and Blue. Also the fire impacts, air pollution, water pollution, disease, the biodiversity and ecosystems that have been destroyed, the mangrove forests that have been wiped out, and all sorts of other conflicts, including the cultural problems by the loss and reduction of ecosystems. This is something that I think that Americans don't realize what their legacy is.
Yes, the effects of war continue long after the bombing stops. The landmines, for example, killed many thousands of people since the war, and probably, as I understand it, more have been killed from landmines after the war than our own soldiers died during the war. As you mentioned, the loss of mangroves. Of course, mangrove swamps along the coast are huge and really important ecosystems for nurseries, for the marine and estuarine systems. These impacts continue. They affect our own men and women affected by, as you mentioned, Agent Orange, and we still have today a not well-recognized set of diseases that are caused by the impacts of these chemicals, both on the indigenous people as well as our own men and women that come home with that. There's also the psychological impacts that we can't forget, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and the tragedy of having more men and women commit suicide following the Vietnam War than were killed during the war, a direct result of the psychological impacts.
Since I was active in the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, I learned so much from your book about the uniqueness of Vietnam, the environment and ecosystems that we never learned about during the anti-war movement. And you talked about how just recently, a few years ago, Vietnam was recognized for their geoparks by UNESCO, and also how they were saving the Bengal tiger on one of their islands.
One of the impacts of war is trophy hunting and the also killing of animals for food during the disruption of cultures and the like. The last Vietnamese rhino, a special form of the Asian rhino, has been killed. During the war, many tigers were shot and killed, elephants and the like. And so these large mammals are at risk in any conflict in particular, whether it's for food or destruction of habitat or trophy hunting. And one of the things about Vietnam is that plate tectonics, or the movement of Earth plates and the crashing of them and forming of mountains and the like, is one of the reasons why Vietnam is so important for its minerals. Its huge wealth of minerals comes from the fact that the Asian and Eurasian plates happen to connect in North Vietnam, and in that process have created a rift zone with hugely important mineral deposits. And those mineral deposits are the basis of a lot of conflict. Minerals that are important for rare earth minerals, for example, for jets and computers and the like. So Vietnam is still today a focus of great international envy because of its wealth.
You also spent a lot of time in your book describing the problems of trying to get conscientious objector status, and also finding a place that could utilize the knowledge that you had as a botanist. You didn't want to just serve someplace where you were a janitor or just cleaning up someplace. And you were successful at one point of getting a position with the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, which is now Drexel University, and working with their herbarium collection, which has apparently over 1 million species, but you were just working on about 90,000 of their backlog. You were discovering that these had been saved in old newspapers from the early 1800s and just never really cataloged. Why do we need to save these ancient plants?
Well, they became important in the story that I continued to tell regarding the early investigations of the natural history of North America, as an example for anywhere in the world. Because those who are first there get to see environments that have not received some of the impacts of Industrial Revolution, for example, and the like. From the Philadelphia area, the early botanists, the exploring expeditions, and the botanists that came over were often hired by the wealthy Philadelphians, and these important specimens today, some of which were in that backlog, document the way these ecosystems were prior to a lot of impacts. And so as part of my field work for my Conscientious Objector or Civilian Alternative Service, I explored the Delaware Valley rivers, the coastal rivers of New Jersey, the Middle Atlantic states' coastal systems in general, and was able to determine how many species had been lost, one presumably extinct, and how many had changed their ranges and had reduced their extent, and how many ecosystems had been impacted, because we knew what was there and what was published in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And we knew the accuracy of that because we have the specimens before us today. Now, 50 years later, I'm using my work to look back and see the changes that continue with accelerated climate change. And one of the big impacts is the increase in sea level rise as a result of global warming, thermal expansion of the ocean, as well as melting of glaciers. And that then brings saltwater further up rivers, impacting freshwater intertidal zones, eliminating more habitats, potentially extirpating more species. And the freshwater intertidal zones that are so vulnerable globally are now forced into only the area of ports and bulkheads, and we're in the process of potentially losing these valuable nursery lands. My work 50 years ago can be used to interpret the things that are changing today, but my work is based upon others who were collecting here in the 18th and 19th centuries.
But your work is involved with estuarine systems, freshwater intertidal habitats, vernal pools, the restoration, enhancement, and creation of wetland and upland habitats, groundwater monitoring for remediation projects, and you've done some research with salt marsh plants. Some of them don't even have common names. Which ones have you focused on?
My work in UC Santa Barbara focused on the biodiversity of salt marshes, something I was interested in the East Coast. Estuaries tend to be brackish freshwater or intertidal freshwater rivers and brackish estuaries and coastal salt marshes. And so the New Jersey, Middle Atlantic state area had plenty of that. Moving to Santa Barbara, I found that many of those estuaries were not investigated in any detail. And so there were species new to science in the genus Sueda, seepweed, that I was interested in, discovering one of them there right at the estuary outside the campus of UC Santa Barbara. And also in the restoration of salt marshes, such as Carpentry Salt Marsh that I was director of, and other threatened habitats. Probably 95% of the coastal wetlands in California have been destroyed by urbanization, by port development, by general filling, agriculture, sedimentation. And so there's a great interest in the state, as there is elsewhere throughout the country and the world now, in trying to restore these areas, bring back their value for nurseries for fishes and the like. And that is something I dedicated myself to in detail while I was in Santa Barbara. Interestingly, in Vietnam, there's a great interest in restoring the mangroves, and there's a big effort for them to both protect coasts as well as provide nurseries for their fisheries. So there's a global effort. It's a good thing to see, but with climate change, sea level rise, and changing temperatures in the ocean and the like, there's a lot of work ahead to be able to try to prevent some of the mass extinctions, loss of habitats, and other things that go on. With the work I did during the Vietnam War as a conscientious objector, I've tried to apply those ethics and interests throughout my life because I was given the chance to do that, where others, such as Jerry Wayne Ferren, who I mentioned in the book, who died at 19 as a father of a child he never met, he and I were born the same year, a couple months apart, but going to war, he was killed in Khe Sanh, and I tried to dedicate a lot of the book to understanding the dualities and the what-ifs. What if Jerry Wayne Ferren hadn't gone to Vietnam? What if Wayne Ferren from Canton, New Jersey had? Where would we be today? The contributions that Jerry Wayne Ferren could have made weren't made. He wasn't even supposed to be on the plane that was shot down, but in a change of personnel, he was the flight engineer crash landed carrying helicopter fuel and died from his burns a month later.
You have some great stories in your book, Conscientious Objector, A Journey of Peace, Justice, Culture, and Environment, and we'll talk more about some of those experiences that you've had when we return in a moment with my guest, Wayne R. Ferren, Jr.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Wayne R. Ferren, Jr., a botanist, an ecologist. This is really part one of your memoir, and you talk about your early environmental awareness when you were at Rutgers Camden University, when you helped organize the first Earth Day, and you created the Save the Earth Committee. And I was busy here in Los Angeles and Southern California organizing Earth Day activities at campuses here. I think that awareness is so important to our involvement as activists over the years. You read some of the books that impacted you. You mentioned Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb. You mentioned some of the early books, and there were very few of them at the time, connecting human impacts on the environment. What were some of the works that really meant a lot to you?
The coursework I had at Rutgers I thought was phenomenal. I was a geology major because growing up in New Jersey, always collected fossils, dinosaur bones, and was very interested in the evolution of life from the perspective of paleontology. I had a profound impact from Ralph Good, who was a plant ecologist and who hired me to work in the herbarium, the collection of press-dried voucher specimens that form the basis of a lot of research. And so I got training there, and as I became more and more interested in botany and ecology, I took courses that were associated with that and graduated with my degree in geology. But found important works like Eugene Odom and his work in ecology. As you said, the mid-60s to early 70s, a lot of the understanding of ecological principles we have today were not there at the time. And it was a great opportunity to think in terms of one principle that I brought into my claim of conscientious objection, the idea of energy flow within ecosystems and between ecosystems, and the idea of food chain and energy and the connectiveness of all things. And so that approach that I thought was so important to me, in addition to the need to describe my feelings as I was going to claim conscientious objection, one has to remember that the Supreme Court of the United States changed the interpretation of the law through time. And so my claim of conscientious objection had to be explained in a religious context, a more traditional religious context. And I tried to do that using transcendentalism, Buddhism, and my interest in the energy flow in ecosystems to demonstrate that my passion for this and my understanding for that was just as valid as a traditional religious belief. But 3 days after I applied for my conscientious objector status, the Supreme Court reinterpreted the Selective Service Act, saying that, in fact, strongly held ethical beliefs, not just traditional but religious beliefs, are in fact also part of the understanding of the Selective Service Act. And with that, a lot of young men were able to then claim their strongly held anti-war ethics, such as the impacts of ecosystems and their inability to participate. That changed everything.
You have taken your strong ethical belief system and incorporated it not just into your scientific research work, but into your work to preserve and protect ecosystems. And so you worked for 26 years at the University of California at Santa Barbara. You founded their Museum of Systematics and Ecology. You'll have to explain what systemics is. because you directed the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Reserve, and Carpinteria is a very famous area just south of Santa Barbara, and you served as assistant director of the University of California, Santa Barbara's Natural Reserve System. And the University of California has natural reserves from every university. How many are there, and what kind of ecosystems are protected and preserved?
System-wide, the University of California system has the largest set of institutional reserves in the world. And they occur throughout the state of California in different habitats and are preserved for research, education, outreach, public service, and for their natural heritage. There are approximately 40 reserves now, somewhere between 35 and 40, that represent mountain, desert, salt marsh, grassland, all sorts of ecosystems available for not only conservation, but primarily for the availability for university research and education, and then available for public outreach. So these are extremely important. It was an honor to work for a while as the assistant director of the University of Santa Barbara's collection of them, which are 6. And then to work on Carpinteria Salt Marsh, developing management plan, the restoration plan, and implementing a restoration project that included public access, endangered species recovery, and habitat restoration. While I was performing those duties, my primary employment was the executive director of the Museum of Systematics and Ecology, and Systematics is the study of the biodiversity of life. Today, the Cheadle Center for Biodiversity and Restoration Ecology is the newly formed institution based upon what I was involved in the formation of the museum. And the center today manages lands, implements restoration projects, and maintains a valuable systematics collections of plants and animals, documenting research, has education programs and teaching.
In fact, you were involved in the restoration of the Lagoon Park there near the University of California, Santa Barbara campus, and you have been pushing for bioswales. You'll have to explain what they are, and constructed wetlands with native plants, not just exotic species.
Yes, well, that was a really groundbreaking project that myself, a number of others, we worked with Benata Associates design. That project was initially designed to have the runoff from the student housing project go underground. And of course, there's no treatment then. Any water that's running off goes into the campus lagoon or the ocean without any treatment. Some of us argued for having all of the groundwater brought above ground in bioswales, of these swales which runoff would occur, and planting them with native plants to assimilate the nutrients so that by the time the runoff went through swales into constructed wetlands and drained into the campus lagoon or the ocean, the water was purified. And that at one point we demonstrated like 90% of the nutrients were removed by the native plants. Some were more important facilitators than others, and this was part of the research project. But the Lagoon Park project is part of the Manzanita Village, won a very prestigious national award with the Association of Landscape Architects. It was awarded several awards from the Regional Water Quality Control Board in California, and set the stage. One of the important things about the University of California, Santa Barbara is its very progressive approach to using its surrounding lands to design and mitigate projects for its growth. And so that all the natural areas are maintained, restored, used for research and education in this wonderful setting of coastline habitat. It's a very important thing to see, and I was happy to be able to participate in the formation of that approach to university management.
In fact, just off the coastline, a few miles out in the sea, are the Channel Islands, and they are being restored. You're active on the board of directors of the Channel Islands Restoration, but you haven't forgotten your East Coast roots. You're also active with the Flora of New Jersey project, but you continue to have memberships in numerous scientific and environmental organizations, including the California Botanical Society. Are we still active in trying to preserve and protect protect and restore what natural systems we haven't built on?
Yes, well, the Channel Islands are very exciting. In fact, universities had a reserve out there, Santa Cruz Island Reserve, for a number of decades. And we were leaders as a university in conducting research, education, and developing restoration components. The Nature Conservancy stepped in, and now the National Park Service. The Channel Islands Restoration is a nonprofit organization that started out working on restoration projects on the islands and continues to do that, both for the military that owns some of the islands, as well as the National Park Service and Nature Conservancy, but also as a number of projects on the mainland. And there's quite a few in restoring rivers and grasslands, and it's instrumental in helping to recently, just this year, preserve the West Mesa San Marcos foothills for restoration. And that was a big effort on the part of many folks in Santa Barbara that helped raise $20 million towards its preservation and protection from development. However, we're threatened with global conflicts, Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, and all of these conflicts have negative impacts in ecosystems and the cultures they support. My interest in anti-war activities and pointing out the impacts of war are not just from the past in the Vietnam War. An important element of me publishing this book was to demonstrate how one can stand up and say no to war and how one can make positive impacts.
I'm so pleased that you did write this story from your personal perspective, and also that you combined the issue of the environment and war and peace and justice from your own experiences, but how it relates to all of us, both in the past and in the present. You care about social justice as well as the environment, as well as peace. How do you combine those? Because I know that you included in your book a picture of your black sons, and you're concerned about how they're being treated in this current environment.
Yes, I tried to write a multifaceted book that covered many elements of social justice, environmental justice, anti-war activities, because especially at the time, in the late 60s, early 70s, these were an integrated effort of movements, women's movements, the gay rights movements, the civil rights especially, leading us an example, anti-war movements, and the pro-environment First Earth Day in 1970, resulting from, of course, the Santa Barbara oil spill, among other things, in 69. So this multifaceted element was definitely and still is a part of it, because I think today we see that reflected in both all of the issues related to equal justice, Black Lives Matter, and the like. And yes, my interracial marriage and my two sons, I do worry about, although they are now men themselves rather than youth. I don't think there's ever a time in which people of color are without concern. Related then to opportunities, think in terms of me, a college-educated white youth, appearing before 5 middle-aged white men before the draft board, answering all sorts of detailed questions regarding my beliefs. How would that have taken place with either someone of color back then or now, or someone without the education I had? And I think that equity is extremely important in thinking in terms of rights. So I propose in the book and support the national workforce approach, where if we have a draft, or even if it's a volunteer effort, there needs to be opportunities for people of all sorts to not only serve, but to be given opportunities, and not send the least educated, the poorest, and those people of color off to war because they don't have the opportunities that others have had. The integration of all of these movements is important, and it's important today as it was then. And it's something that we need to focus on.
You have engaged in so many scientific research efforts, and you have been so active in trying to preserve and protect natural areas and restore natural areas. Are we going to be able to save more rare and endangered species and protect habitat? Is it just going to be a plant in an herbarium that we find out existed on this planet, but we've lost it?
Yes, we are. but climate change is a huge factor. We need to prepare for migrations of animals and plants. We need to accommodate sea level rise, because while we might be able to reduce some of the impacts are already happening today, and it will be a challenge if it even gets worse. Mass extinctions are possible. I would like to think we can work together to prevent that and the extinction of cultures as well.
Thank you so very much for this incredible book with so much wonderful information about what has happened, what is going on, and thank you very much for being my guest.
Thank you, Nancy. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very thankful.
I have been speaking with Wayne R. Ferren, Jr., who is a botanist and ecologist and author of Conscientious Objector, A Journey of Peace, Justice, Culture, and Environment. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.